The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 led to the deadliest war in the history of the world. Billions of people died in the northern hemisphere alone, and a countless number of people died from the radiation in Africa and South America. It was the most catastrophic thing to ever happen, yet it somehow never happened. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a product of the Cold War which followed World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union, though allies during the war, parted ways soon afterward. The Soviets were dissatisfied with the peace settlements after the war. Though it was decided that countries in Eastern Europe would have elections to determine their own forms of government, democratic or communist, the Soviets broke this agreement very quickly. The Soviet Union's leader Nikita Khrushchev led his country in helping to establish and support communist governments in neighboring Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania. Eastern Europe soon became a communist stronghold with the Soviets at the head. The United States was a leader in prompting and defending democracy. Tensions grew between these two superpowers out of basic differences in political agendas and their struggles for supremacy. A nuclear arms race began as the two countries built up their weapons storage, each trying to stay ahead of the other. In the middle of these tensions, the US placed Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Because the Soviets could see Turkey from their home soil, this was a major cause of concern for them. On the other hand, Fidel Castro, leader of Cuba, established ties with the Soviet Union, becoming the only communist country in the West, just 90 miles off of the coast of Florida. This required the United States to keep a close eye on these enemies in their backyard. Pictures taken on a routine reconnaissance mission by a U-2 plane on the 14th of October showed that construction of nuclear missile bases on Cuba had begun. Khrushchev had said no missiles capable of reaching the United States would be placed on Cuba, and promised U.S. President John F. Kennedy that they were only sending resources and defensive weapons to the island. President Kennedy's actions against those missiles was something that not many thought he could pull off. He established a naval blockade that was peaceful yet powerful enough to prevent nuclear capabilities in Cuba. Kennedy stood up against his advisors and initiated this blockade even though almost none of them thought it would be effective. They thought that only military force would be strong enough to get the missiles off of the island. If President Kennedy would have followed the counsel of his advisors and carried out the full-scale invasion of Cuba, nuclear war would have been brought on the world. By placing missiles in Cuba, the Soviet Union challenged the warning President Kennedy had issued in September, stating that any offensive weapons put on Cuba by the Soviet Union was an act of war and that it would not be tolerated. The first of the nuclear warheads started to arrive in Cuba on October 4th, hitting on Soviet cargo ships. As the number of Soviet personnel in Cuba grew and the flow of ships increased, the U.S. started to monitor those ships more closely. The U.S. became so concerned that every Soviet ship traveling to Cuba was photographed from either U.S. boats or planes. By the time President Kennedy was informed of the weapons, two medium-range ballistic missiles (MRBMs) capable of carrying nuclear warheads with a range of 1,000 miles were operational, and 6 to 8 more would be ready by the end of the week. In addition, two intermediate-range ballistic missiles (IRBMs) with a range of about 2,200 miles, able to reach Washington, D.C., would be operational in 6 to 8 weeks. Back in 1961, in the first 100 days of Kennedy's presidency, he had authorized the CIA to arm and train 1,400 Cuban refugees for the purpose of attacking an airbase on Cuba in order to aid the Cubans in overthrowing Castro's dictatorship. When the Cubans failed at the attack, President Kennedy took full responsibility. One reason Kennedy felt fully responsible for this failure, which came to be known as the Bay of Pigs, is that he didn't rely on many advisors to help him make these decisions. When the nuclear missiles were found on Cuba, he made sure that he did not make the same mistake twice. That is how the Executive Committee of National Security Council, or EXCOM, came to be. It consisted of 15 men from the top levels of military and government. All of the EXCOM agreed that the missiles had to be removed from Cuba, but nobody could agree on how that should be done. Three basic routes were proposed: 1. An invasion of Cuba, 2. A naval blockade, or 3. A negotiation or trade. As one general put it, we could take them out, squeeze them out, or buy them out. The invasion proposals included airstrikes that could have been a surgical airstrike, as EXCOM member Bundy, special agent for national security, put it, where only the missiles would be taken out, all the way to destroying all offensive targets such as airfields and nuclear storage. Airstrikes would have been combined with invasions of ground forces. These plans ranged from taking out the missile bases only, all the way to a full-scale invasion of the island with the United States taking control of Cuba. Under the naval blockade or quarantine, U.S. ships would constantly monitor what went into Cuba by inspecting the ships and their contents. Only medicines and food would be allowed through the blockade. Under the negotiation route, the U.S. would try to make some sort of trade. In the early stages of the crisis, the Hawks and the Doves came out. The Hawks wanted to solve the solution by force and military means. The leading Hawk demanding immediate airstrikes was former Secretary of State Dean Acheson. Most of the ex-com fell into this group, including Douglas Dillon and John McCone. Then there was the Doves. They wanted a more peaceful solution like the blockade, negotiation, or trade. This group consisted of Robert F. Kennedy, George W. Ball, and Theodore Sorensen. Out of all of the different opinions and options that were given to President Kennedy, he chose the middle ground, the most peaceful and effective option. He chose a naval blockade or quarantine of Cuba. He announced the blockade along with a warning to the Soviets in a speech on October 22nd. In his speech, he said,
"Shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union."
In the first day of the blockade, all Soviet ships either turned around, stopped, or slowed down except for one, and it was carrying necessities, not weapons. This course of action may not have been the most popular in the ex-com, but it was proven to be effective. Kennedy took in a wide range of information and intelligence they could gather along with all advice that ex-com had to give him, and he made the best decision that he could. Even with most of the ex-com pressuring him to rush into war, he stayed calm and made what would prove to be a very good decision. He stated, "We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the cost of worldwide nuclear war, which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth." All throughout the blockade, Kennedy and Khrushchev were communicating, trying to end the crisis. After the blockade had been in effect for 4 days, Khrushchev sent a proposal to the United States saying that if the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba, the missiles would be taken off of the island. Then, the very next day, he went back on his word and said that the missiles would be taken off of the island if the Jupiter missiles were removed from Turkey. That same day, a U-2 spy plane was shot down. Again, the ex-com called for military action. The Joint Chiefs of Staff demanded an immediate airstrike, and the State Department told Kennedy to refuse the missile trade. Kennedy and his advisors did not know at the time that Soviet soldiers in Cuba were armed with short-range nuclear weapons that could have destroyed U.S. forces if they would have tried to land on Cuban beaches. The Soviets also had 4 heavily armed subs en route. Had the U.S. attacked, the results would have been disastrous. Fortunately, Kennedy refused to plunge the nation and the world into nuclear war. He and Khrushchev both recognized that avoiding nuclear holocaust was more important than national pride, and were able to come to a compromise. The Soviets would remove missiles from Cuba in exchange for a promise from the U.S. that it would not attack Cuba. Further, the U.S. would secretly remove the missiles from Turkey at a later date, which it did the following April. One of the reasons that President Kennedy chose that course of action was because his brother Robert pointed out that if the U.S. carried out a surprise attack on Cuba, it would turn out much like Pearl Harbor, but it would cause war, not just bring another country into it. The blockade was the right course of action for many reasons. The biggest of those is the fact that it saved the world from war, the most devastating war in history, nuclear war. The whole world nervously watched the crisis unfold. The head of the United Nations Security Council cautioned Kennedy, "What is at stake is not just the interest of the parties directly involved, but the very fate of mankind." If Kennedy would have attacked Cuba, the Soviets would have retaliated, and the world would have been launched into nuclear war. By choosing the middle ground and implementing a naval blockade and using diplomatic measures rather than military force, John F. Kennedy stood up to stop the war that never was.